5,000 years ago, Europe's population collapsed. For decades, everyone blamed the invaders. The plague got there first. By 3500 BCE, Neolithic farming communities had spread across every corner of Europe. They had built megalithic monuments, domesticated animals, and developed sophisticated pottery traditions across a continent that had been home to hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years. These were not primitive people. They built the first permanent settlements in European history. By 3500 BCE, Europe was home to several distinct farming cultures. Each had developed its own pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns across territories spanning thousands of square kilometers. They traded polished stone axes and obsidian tools across hundreds of kilometers. These communities were connected. Then, between 3000 and 2500 BCE, something catastrophic happened. The population crashed. Archaeological evidence from across Europe shows a dramatic reduction in settlement density during this period. Villages that had been occupied for centuries were suddenly abandoned across a vast geographic range stretching from Scandinavia to the Balkans. Pollen records confirmed forests, rapidly reclaimed cultivated land. Fields farmed for generations reverted to wilderness. The standard explanation for this collapse has been the Yamnaya migration. Steppe herders from the Pontic-Caspian grasslands expanded westward into Europe around 3000 BCE, and within centuries, they had replaced the majority of European ancestry. The invasion theory was clean and simple. Steppe warriors arrived and conquered old Europe. Case closed. But in 2018, a discovery in a Swedish tomb changed the timeline of everything. Nicole Raskovan at the Institute Pasteur was analyzing ancient DNA from a Neolithic mass burial in Sweden. Inside the grave, they found a young woman who had died around 20 years of age. Her bones showed no visible signs of trauma or disease. But when they sequenced her DNA, they found something else entirely. Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. The plague genome from her bones was the oldest strain of Yersinia pestis ever found in a human. This was not the Black Death. This was something far older and potentially far more significant for understanding the Neolithic collapse. The strain was 5,000 years old, and it was found in a farmer, not a steppe nomad. Raskovan's team published in Cell in 2018. They proposed a radical reinterpretation of the collapse. The paper argued that plague swept through Neolithic European farming communities before the Yamnaya steppe herders arrived. Not after. The invaders did not cause the collapse. They walked into the aftermath. The distinction is critical. The difference between invasion and migration into an already empty landscape completely changes the story of European prehistory. If plague came first, the steppe people did not conquer Europe. They inherited it. The Neolithic plague was genetically different from the medieval Black Death in important ways. The Neolithic strain lacked the YMT gene that allows the plague bacterium to survive inside fleas. Without this gene, the disease could not have been transmitted by flea bites from rats. The Neolithic plague likely spread through respiratory transmission between humans. Pneumonic plague is deadlier than bubonic. Pneumonic plague kills within days. In a densely packed Neolithic farming village, it would have been devastating. Neolithic communities lived in close quarters. Extended families shared single longhouses. The conditions for respiratory disease transmission were ideal. A single infected individual entering a village could have triggered an unstoppable chain of transmission within days. Since Raskovan's initial discovery, additional Neolithic plague genomes have been recovered from sites across northern and central Europe. The disease was not isolated to one community. Multiple sites, multiple countries, the same ancient plague strain. This was a continent-wide pandemic. In 2021, plague genomes were recovered from Neolithic sites in Germany and the Baltic. The geographic pattern suggests the plague may have originated in the densely populated mega-settlements of the Cucutini, Tripilia culture in modern Ukraine and Romania, which were among the largest settlements in the world, at that time with populations reaching over 10,000 people. The Tripilia megasites were enormous. Some covered over 300 hectares. Then they were suddenly abandoned. These mega-settlements had no sanitation. Thousands of people and livestock together created perfect conditions for disease. The Tripilia collapse around 3200 BCE coincides precisely with the earliest known plague detections. The megasites were abandoned and never reoccupied, and the population dispersed into smaller scattered communities that left far less archaeological evidence. The largest civilization in Neolithic Europe vanished, and plague was already circulating in that exact region at that exact time. The Tripilia plague connection is circumstantial but compelling. No plague DNA has been recovered from a Tripilia site. The absence of direct evidence is not evidence of absence. Tripilia sites have been extensively excavated for architecture and pottery, but rarely sampled for ancient pathogen DNA. The bones are there. The technology exists. Somebody just needs to test them. Now here is where the story intersects with the Yamnaya migration. The timing is not a coincidence. In every region where the timeline can be reconstructed, the plague appears before the steppe migrants arrive. The disease swept through first. The people followed. The Yamnaya herders had several advantages that may have protected them from the plague. They were nomadic pastoralists. They lived in small, mobile groups spread across vast, open grasslands. Low population density and high mobility are natural barriers to respiratory disease transmission. The same conditions that made Neolithic villages vulnerable made Yamnaya camps resilient. Epidemiologists call this the basic reproduction number. In a dense village, one infected person spreads disease to many others. In a dispersed camp, the chain breaks after 1 or 2 transmissions. The farmers were sitting targets. The herders were moving targets. That difference may have decided the fate of a continent. A plague outbreak in a Yamnaya camp would infect a few people, then burn out. Nobody else was nearby. The farmers were trapped by their farms. The herders could simply move away from infection. Some researchers have proposed an additional factor. The Yamnaya may have carried partial genetic immunity to plague from generations of low-level exposure on the steppe where the bacterium had been circulating in rodent populations long before it jumped to humans. Yersinia pestis is maintained in rodent reservoirs. Steppe burrowing rodents carry plague to this day. If the Yamnaya had lived alongside plague, carrying rodents for centuries, natural selection may have already equipped their immune systems with some degree of resistance before they ever encountered the Neolithic farmers. The Neolithic farmers had never encountered Yersinia pestis. They had zero immunity. It was a virgin soil epidemic. A virgin soil epidemic strikes populations with no prior exposure. Mortality routinely exceeds 50%. The parallel with the post-Columbian devastation of the Americas is striking and deliberate in the scientific literature. European diseases killed up to 90% of some indigenous American populations, and the subsequent European colonization filled the demographic vacuum left behind. Raskovan explicitly drew this comparison. Plague may have done to Neolithic Europe what smallpox did to the Americas. Not every scholar agrees with this interpretation. The debate remains active and intense. Some archaeologists argue the Yamnaya had genuine military advantages that should not be dismissed. David Anthony and Christian Christensen have emphasized the role of Yamnaya horse domestication and wheel technology in enabling rapid territorial expansion, regardless of plague dynamics. Critics argue that a handful of plague detections across 500 years does not prove a continental pandemic. The disease may have been endemic at low levels rather than sweeping through in a catastrophic wave. Ancient pathogen DNA is extremely difficult to detect. What we have found may be the tip of the iceberg. Only a fraction of excavated Neolithic remains have been screened for pathogens. Most were dug up before DNA technology. 12 confirmed cases from 2,000 screened individuals is a detection rate of roughly 0.5%. If that rate holds across the unscreened 50,000, there could be hundreds of plague victims waiting to be identified. The material exists. It is sitting in museum storage facilities across Europe, waiting for someone to test it. The answer may already be sitting in a museum storage box somewhere in Eastern Europe. The Neolithic collapse may not be unique. Several other prehistoric population crashes around the world share similar patterns of rapid decline, followed by cultural replacement from outside populations. New excavations targeting pathogen detection are underway at Tripilia sites. Results could come soon. within years. The answer to whether Neolithic plague was a pandemic may already be in a museum storage box. Every untested bone is a potential data point. The technology is ready. The funding is the bottleneck. Every new plague detection pushes the evidence further toward the pandemic hypothesis. And detections are accelerated. The plague hypothesis also explains a puzzle that the invasion model never could. Why did the Yamnaya expansion succeed so completely? The Yamnaya had horses and wheeled vehicles, but they were pastoral herders, not professional soldiers. Conquering a continent of millions of established farmers with small bands of mounted herders is militarily implausible. Unless the farming populations were already devastated, unless plague had already done the work that no army could. If plague reduced the population by 50%, survivors would be scattered and weakened beyond organized defense. Migrating into a continent emptied by plague requires no army. It requires only the willingness to move. This three-phase model elegantly explains both the genetic data showing near total population replacement and the archaeological evidence showing relatively little violence during the transition. The Yamnaya did not need to fight because there was almost nobody left to fight against. The absence of warfare evidence is one of the strongest arguments for the plague hypothesis. Conquest leaves traces. Migration into empty land does not. There is a deeper implication. The plague did not just clear the land. It shaped European immunity. Modern Europeans carry distinctive immune gene patterns consistent with strong ancient pathogen-driven selection. The Neolithic plague, the Black Death, and centuries of other infectious diseases have collectively sculpted the European immune system into what it is today. Each pandemic killed the vulnerable and concentrated the resistant, permanently altering the genetic landscape of the continent. The Neolithic plague is just the oldest chapter in a story that is still being written inside our immune systems. The world that emerged from the Neolithic collapse was fundamentally different from the one that preceded it. Old Europe was communal, agricultural, and sedentary. The new Europe was hierarchical, pastoral, and mobile. The plague may have made that transformation possible by destroying the social fabric of the old world entirely. The monument builders of old Europe had no word for plague. They had no concept of bacteria. 5,000 years later, their bones told us what they never could. A bacterium killed them before the horsemen arrived. Plague preceded the steppe migration. The Neolithic farming communities of Europe were already collapsing before the Yamnaya arrived. The DNA of a 5,000-year-old pathogen rewrote the story of how modern Europe was born. The horsemen came, but the plague was already there, and the world they entered was already dying. Inside this skull was the oldest plague genome ever found. A 20-year-old woman from Sweden who died 5,000 years ago carrying a bacterium that may have helped end an entire civilization. The invaders got the credit. The plague did the work. And the bones finally told us which came first. The evidence is in the bones. The plague arrived before the horses, and old Europe was already gone. If this story changed how you think about the past, subscribe. The bones